Now the NEM, its job, as we alluded to earlier in the first presentation, is to bridge the gap between the operator's systems and the SIBA pod. So the operator may have certain OSS systems that they use. In AT&T, ONAP is one example. And the NEM layer sort of is the top layer of the SIBA pod, which provides a convenient interface for these operators to use to manage pod. The components within the NEM are optional to the extent that not all operators may use all components. So we think there's some mix of maybe some of them are mandatory, but some of them are optional. Maybe an operator has a different way of doing a particular thing like monitoring or orchestration. You don't have to use the whole NEM. You can pick and choose the parts of it that are important to you. The NEM is where you will find much of our FCAPS infrastructure, so our various monitoring, logging, performance tools will be in there. It's also where you'll find infrastructure services like the message bus, you'll find Kafka, and it's where we do our service abstraction and modeling stuff. So we will be talking about a particular component that we developed at ONF called XOS, and how XOS breaks services into service-specific extensions that allow us to extend the NEM with new functionality, and about how services implement workflows that will implement operator-specific business logic. So you can see here that the SIBA pod, so the NEM is this topmost layer, and it's got these various components inside of it. I'm going to go through a container diagram in a moment, but the NEM is taking various inputs from the operator, such as a description of the OLTs, a whitelist of ONUs, what ONUs are permitted, various subscriber information. And through use of a model-based service definition, it will ingest that information and use that to configure these components below it, such as the ONOS apps, Volta, and other services that are running on the pod. So the NEM is fundamentally a collection of containers. We've kind of split this up a little bit where you will have the management containers here on the left side of the picture and the monitoring containers on the right side of the picture. So on the left side, there is the northbound management interface. That's where the operator would interface with the pod, and you can talk to it over a variety of interfaces. I have color-coded these. Over here you can see the color codes. Some of the interfaces are Google gRPC. So like this line here is a direct gRPC interface into XOS. Other interfaces use REST. So we can talk REST via something called Chameleon, which is a translator, or we can talk REST to something we call the Tosca engine, which lets you run Tosca recipes on XOS. XOS here is an infrastructure component. It's basically a relational database type thing. We'll be getting into some discussion of the XOS core later. It's connected to a database. In our case, I believe it's Postgres that provides the persistence for stuff that is managed by XOS. Sure, so Chameleon is a translator that translates from gRPC to REST. So its value is in components that don't speak gRPC natively. So one of those is our GUI, which I believe currently uses REST to make its requests to the XOS core. So it's basically for any component that wants to use REST instead of gRPC. Tosca is a sort of a declarative recipe language. It's like a YAML-ish thing. Well, you saw the things that Andy ran. So you make up these recipes. Often you use it for provisioning, and you will describe, this is how I want my services set up, or this is how I want my pod set up. You'll make a Tosca recipe. You'll submit it to the Tosca engine. Now, the gRPC interface, that would be more for dynamic runtime stuff. So as you're adding and deleting subscribers or you're querying state, you will do that over gRPC. So often we see that Tosca is more for provisioning, gRPC is more for runtime dynamic management. Sure. So let's see, I think I described XOS as sort of the database management, persistence layer. And then the way we designed it is we want the NEM to be very extensible. So we have divided XOS into this core part, which is very service independent, and then this service specific part down here, which implements these, we call them synchronizers. And each one of these contains service specific logic. So to extend XOS so that it knows how to talk to the fabric, for example, there's a fabric service. To extend XOS so that it knows how to program cross connects through the fabric to connect the OLTs via Volta to the BNG. We have a fabric cross connect service. We have the Volt service, which is managing the virtual OLT abstraction through Volta and Onos. We have something that does subscribers that encompasses the notion of a subscriber. So all of these synchronizers, they both specify the models and contain a lot of the code that implements the interface between XOS and those particular services. So that's kind of the management pipeline down that side of the page. Over here on this side of the page, we have a lot of the monitoring infrastructure. And for that, we've largely used off-the-shelf open source components. So Grafana and Prometheus are very popular for storing performance metrics and visualizing them. We have an exporter that we have written and the community has been working on improving that takes stuff it finds on Kafka, published by Volta or Onos, and exports that to Prometheus, where it is aggregated in the database and then visualized in Grafana. For logging, we have Kibana and Elasticsearch, which are very popular open source logging components. And we also have, sort of supporting this whole thing, we have Kafka. I stuck Kafka over here, but didn't really draw any lines to it because it's got lines connecting many different components on this, in the NEM. So Kafka is a general purpose message bus. It's used for everything from getting events into the monitoring components to getting events out of XOS so that XOS can notify the GUI and other things of important developments in the data model. Sure.
Particularly on the right side, could you talk about which of those are straight upstream projects or which ones maybe you've customized within SIBA?
So on the Grafana, Prometheus, and Kibana, Elasticsearch,
Yep.
those are we're pretty much using off-the-shelf components for that. We have configured them, so we've developed our own Helm charts that configure them, but we have not really customized those components in depth, I don't think.
So it's mostly just a Helm chart that's unique to...
Yeah, it's pretty much the Helm chart that knows how to bring this stuff up. The exporter is something we did. It's actually called the Kafka topic exporter, and it listens to the Kafka bus and pushes those things to Prometheus. And we have people from Stairlight who are working on that exporter.
Great, thanks.
Sure. So what exactly does XOS do? So XOS, its job is to take all of this stuff over here and operationalize it to the operator. So this is an old slide, so it doesn't necessarily have the whole pile of stuff we have, but you can kind of imagine there are a lot of various services running inside of the pod. There's Onos and its various Onos apps. There's Kubernetes and various VNFs running on Kubernetes. You would also find Volta in here. You've got hardware down here. You've got your servers, your commodity servers, your switches. Volta and its OLTs would be in here. It's kind of take all of that and present a uniform interface to the operator, while at the same time being configurable and extensible. So XOS is intended to be a very dynamic thing, and this diagram kind of churns around. So you can imagine at runtime you decide to add some new services. You might deploy new Helm charts via Helm. Those Helm charts might push new specifications of models to XOS. You might also push in new Tosca recipes to re-provision these new services. and send that all via configuration into XOS, where XOS will update its data models and bring all of these services into compliant with what you want the state of your pod to be. So it's very much a management and orchestration type of component. And XOS does this by implementing a data model. So XOS, the data model it exports is not necessarily any particular database, but it is very much in the flavor of a traditional relational database management system. So if you're familiar with things like MySQL or Postgres, it's that sort of thing, and we do actually use Postgres as our back end. We do some extension on top of that. So for example, we have the notion of inheritance, so that the core can supply certain base models and services can inherit and override those models to provide custom variants and custom functionality. So the core does supply a number of service independent models. So we have, for example, a user hierarchy that lets you have a user that can log into the GUI, and we have various security around that, so that when you log into the GUI, it checks your password, it knows what models you can access. There's a whole role-based security model in there. We have the notion of compute resources, network resources. There's a whole bunch of core contributions. So then we have service-specific models, and these will be contributed by the services. So there's kind of three types of service-specific models, and I will work through a very quick example on the next page. But a service will typically have a service model, which is kind of its global configuration. Like, I am the virtual OLT service. Here is the global information about the virtual OLT service. Then there will be these service instance models, and we generally use those anytime that we have to kind of subdivide a service into pieces that are important for some entity. So generally we divide services by subscribers. So you might have the virtual OLT service, but each subscriber does own an ONU inside of the virtual OLT service because the subscriber has an ONU at his house. We will typically take these per subscriber service instances, we'll form them into chains, because the subscriber will actually have a presence throughout the system. He not only has his ONU, he's also got a route through the aggregation switch, for example. And then you'll also find some auxiliary models, which are models that are neither the service nor the service instance, but they're kind of glue that holds the rest of the service together. Now, as an example, and we're not going to work through this in detail, but this is just an example of the kinds of models you'll find in XOS. This is the virtual OLT service. It's present in, it has a sort of a chain of service models that goes across the top here. So you can see that the RCORD service, that is the residential subscriber service, it uses the virtual OLT service because residential subscribers need presence in the OLT. And then the OLT service in turn uses the Fabric Cross Connect service because these OLTs need to be connected to the internet. So that is sort of at the global perspective, but per subscriber, each subscriber has this little piece of this. There is a residential subscriber. He has a point of presence in the Volt service because he uses resources there. And he has a point of presence in the Fabric Cross Connect service because he has that cross connect route that gets him out to the BNG. And then these green models are your auxiliary models. So the virtual OLT service, it needs to know about the inventory of all of these devices that it manages. So it's got models for ONU devices and models for OLT devices. There's an abstraction of a PON network that exists between OLTs and ONUs. And we have ports. So for example, the OLTs have NNI ports and the ONUs have UNI ports. So if you were to look inside of XOS, you would be able to pull out all of these models and see how they were being used in the service. We'll actually look at a couple of them through the GUI. Now this slide is just going to show you a breakdown, not necessarily of the models, but kind of how the information fits together to provide a cohesive picture. So a subscriber, is going to have a location associated with it. The subscriber has an ONU, and his ONU is going to be attached to a PON port. We will end up putting those in a whitelist, and I believe we'll walk through the whitelist in a bit. But that is the location. So that validates a subscriber's specific ONU on a specific PON port, not just any ONU and not just attached to any random PON port. A subscriber also has tags, so he has an S tag and a C tag. Those tell how to route his packets through the OLT and through the aggregation switch. That was SIBA 1.0, the first release we had. SIBA 2.0, as Saurav was kind of showing you on some of the brigade work, we did all of this bandwidth profile and tech profile work. So subscribers became associated with a bandwidth profile, which specified their upstream and downstream bandwidths. And they became associated with a tech profile, which specified their residential, business, et cetera, services that they're able to use. So all of that kind of became involved into this data modeling. And knowing the right places in XOS, you can kind of pull at that information inside of the GUI or from the command line tools. So my understanding is typically, each subscriber will have a CNS tag pair. Different services within a subscriber will have different TCONs and gem ports. Saurav is the expert on this, and I see he has recently appeared, so he could probably answer your question as to how we subdivide this subscriber traffic into the different per service aspects.
So it depends on the operator, actually. So for example, AT&T wants everything on a single TCON and have multiple gem ports, and then be able to take different traffic coming with different P-bits on the VLAN tag, and have those P-bits be mapped into different gem ports and then be scheduled through one TCON. But if you look at, say, Deutsche Telekom or Turk Telekom, they usually use multiple TCONs, and then they map different services to different TCONs. So, for example, in Turk Telecom's multicast service is on a different TCON than the regular unicast traffic. Okay, so it's operator dependent, and the tech profiles that we talked about are basically to serve different operator needs according to the particular deployment that operator has. Does that help answer your question? Okay.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? I think we're about to switch over to more lab work.
Just a couple more on XOS. First of all, you said it's an RDBMS, but is it actually is it just sort of storing all the data in it, or is there a separate data store somewhere along the way?
Yeah, so it is actually backed by Postgres. Okay. So it's kind of a wrapper around Postgres. So I will be giving a talk on Wednesday where I will get into some XOS specifics and how you configure XOS and kind of how it adds value. But basically, XOS allows you to take these sort of specifications for the models, and it will configure the schema in Postgres for you, and it will provide an API, a gRPC-based API that allows you to create, read, update, delete, et cetera, objects within that, and a security layer. So it sort of adds a lot of value on top of your traditional RDBMS.
Got it. And then if there's multiple of these things running up in the world, what is the thought that there's some northbound system that's the master for all these, and it's just sending down the subscriber and topology information that's necessary for that instance?
Yeah, so the operator's OSS system would be on top of this. So one thing we did at one point with AT&T, they implemented an abstract OLT layer, which made the entire pod look like one OLT. And it had like chassis and slots. You'd have to get the AT&T guys to really explain it, but it made it into the right abstraction so that ONAP could understand it, and then ONAP could manage multiple pods. But each operator may have their own way of doing that, of taking multiple pods and managing them from a centralized system.
Got it, thank you.
I'm sorry. In the picture, I don't understand why XOS can control workflow, because workflow is a kind of business logic, so it's a upper layer than the XOS.
Sure, so these, I don't know if you should think of this, well, I guess it depends on how you think about it. So yes, workflow is business logic, but it is implemented inside of an XOS synchronizer. So inside of the workflow box down here, what there is logic that watches, each of these synchronizers will watch the XOS data model for changes and be able to enact certain things. So, well, let me illustrate it with one of the other easier services first, then I'll talk about workflow. So the virtual OLT service, for example, would be watching the database model for a time when an administrator disabled an ONU. And it would go and enact that through Volta to disable an ONU. Now, similarly, the workflow driver is watching for all kinds of other events, both events inside of XOS and events external from places like Kafka. And when it sees an event, it will go in and it will make changes to the data model. So these components should not be seen as simply subservient to the data model, but they're also able to aggregate external stimulus in and put it into the data model. So there's both a downward and an upward path through synchronizers. I think we're ready to proceed to some lab work then.